March 13th, 2026. Adelaide Cottage, Windsor. The rest of the world is still asleep. Sydney is 9 hours ahead, which means the Besties Retreat organizers are in the middle of their afternoon, finalizing the gala seating arrangements and reviewing the list of who has purchased the premium package, the one that includes a guaranteed group photograph with the Duchess of Sussex for $3,200 Australian dollars. The manifestation sessions have been rehearsed, the organic dinner menu has been approved, the luxury accommodation details have been sent to the guests who paid the highest tier. Everything is in place for what the organizers have been promoting for months as Meghan's triumphant return to the country that once adored her. They do not yet know that Prince William has been at his desk for hours. He is not sleeping. He is not in the position of someone who has just woken up to bad news and is reacting to it. He is in the position of someone who has been watching something build for a long time and has decided, sometime in the early hours of this particular Friday, that the moment for restraint has passed. The encrypted lines to his senior legal advisors and diplomatic team are already open. The people on the other end of those calls are not being asked for opinions. They are being given instructions. What is happening at 5 a.m. at Adelaide Cottage is not a consultation. It is the final preparation for an action that has already been decided. The action is what insiders will come to call the steel strike. A systematic, surgical, and in every meaningful sense, absolute dismantling of the Sussex brand's ability to use the British monarchy as a commercial springboard, not a statement. Not a carefully worded palace communication designed to communicate displeasure while leaving all options open. A strike precise, cold, and designed to be permanent. By the time William stepped away from his desk and the first light was coming through the Windsor grounds, the architecture of what would unfold across the next 14 hours had been built. The instructions had been given, the memo had been drafted, the phone calls had been scheduled, the legal directive was already moving through the channels that would give it teeth. To understand why this morning happened, and why this specific event, a weekend retreat in Sydney with a 4-figure ticket price and a Duchess at its center, was the thing that finally made the future king stop asking for restraint and start demanding action. You have to understand what the Besties Retreat actually was, and what it represented to the 100,000 Australian citizens who had signed a petition against it within a single 24-hour period. You have to understand the Sarah Ferguson comparison that royal commentators were already making, and why that comparison, despite its surface familiarity, concealed something significantly more alarming than the original. And you have to understand the specific calculation William had reached, alone at his desk in the early hours of that Friday morning, about the relationship between silence and complicity, and what happens to an institution when the people who are supposed to protect it keep choosing the former because the latter is too uncomfortable to acknowledge. This is the story of March 13th, 2026, the day the half-in, half-out era ended. Not with a statement or a quiet family conversation or the gradual fading of relevance that the palace had perhaps hoped would eventually resolve the situation without requiring anyone to do anything difficult. With a steel strike, with 7 words in a West Wing corridor the previous week still echoing through palace communications, with a diplomatic memo to the Australian government that reclassified a royal duchess as a private citizen in a single paragraph, with a $5 million security bill arriving at the door of a couple who had been operating on the assumption that the institution they had publicly and repeatedly criticized would continue to fund the security arrangements that allowed them to charge 4 figures for proximity to a title. William had decided that assumption was no longer something the monarchy could afford to sustain. The Besties Retreat had been marketed for months as a weekend of empowerment and manifestation set against the backdrop of Sydney's luxury hospitality landscape. The pricing structure was what first attracted serious critical attention. At $3,200 Australian dollars per attendee, the ticket cost was not positioned as a charitable contribution or a fundraising mechanism for any cause beyond the event itself. It purchased a weekend of luxury accommodation, organic catering, group discussions led by Meghan herself, and at the premium tier, a guaranteed group photograph opportunity, and a seat at a gala dinner where the Duchess of Sussex would serve as keynote speaker. The proposition, stripped of its promotional language, was the commercialization of access to a duchess. The title was the product, everything else was the packaging. Royal commentators in the days leading up to the event had been pointing out a distinction that the Australian public appeared to have already grasped instinctively. Working royals attend events. They show up at hospital openings and school visits and community programs and charitable galas, not to generate personal revenue, but to direct public attention toward causes that exist independently of their presence. The relationship between the title and the event is one of service. The prestige of the institution is lent to the cause, which elevates the cause, which is the entire point. What the Besties Retreat inverted was this relationship. The prestige of the institution was being lent not to a cause, but to a personal revenue stream. The title was being used not to amplify something beyond itself, but to generate ticket sales for a private commercial venture. The distinction between a public servant and a private influencer had been collapsed into a single weekend package priced at $3,200. The petition that appeared on change.org under the title "No Royal Grifting on Australian Soil" had surpassed 100,000 signatures within a single 24-hour period. The speed of that accumulation was itself a message, not the result of a coordinated campaign or an organized movement, but the spontaneous response of a population that had seen something and collectively recognized it for what it was. Australians have a specific and well-documented cultural allergy to elitism that wears the costume of accessibility, to prestige that charges for the privilege of proximity while framing the transaction as empowerment. The Besties Retreat had managed to offend this sensibility with a precision that a less commercially confident approach might have avoided. The petition was not just a protest against one event. It was the formalization of a verdict that a very large number of ordinary Australians had reached simultaneously and independently. What focused the fury into something politically impossible to ignore was the emerging reports that the event organizers had made preliminary approaches to local government offices regarding logistical assistance and security support for the retreat. The question that the petition's signatories were asking, and that the editorial boards of several major Australian newspapers were beginning to ask, in considerably more formal language, was why a nurse in Brisbane or a teacher in Perth should see their tax contributions used to provide the security and logistical infrastructure for a private commercial event, charging thousands of dollars per ticket. The answer, self-evidently, was that they should not. But the more uncomfortable question beneath that one, the question that was reaching the desks of government officials in Canberra and the encrypted lines of Adelaide Cottage simultaneously, was why the structural assumption that royal adjacent figures were entitled to state-funded support for their private commercial activities had been allowed to persist as long as it had. Royal commentators were drawing a comparison that initially appeared familiar but revealed, on examination, something considerably more troubling. The name being invoked was Sarah Ferguson, whose financial difficulties and cash for access scandals had become, in the 1990s and early 2000s, the standard reference point for the misuse of royal proximity for personal financial gain. The comparison was superficially apt, but the commentators making it were equally quick to identify the critical difference. Sarah Ferguson's conduct had been, at its core, the result of personal financial desperation and poor judgment, the erratic behavior of someone overwhelmed by debts and operating without adequate counsel. What was being described in Sydney was something structurally different: a planned retreat, a tiered pricing structure, a defined premium package, a keynote address, a gala seating arrangement. This was not desperation. This was a business model. And the title being used to make that business model commercially viable was the same title that its bearer had described, in formal interviews and published memoir, as a source of immense and ongoing personal pain. The perceived duplicity of that position, claiming the injury and then monetizing it simultaneously, was the specific fuel behind the fury that was driving the petition's growth and the quiet but unmistakable hardening of opinion at Kensington Palace. The first formal element of the steel strike was completed at 7:45 in the morning. A diplomatic memo, personally reviewed by the Prince of Wales before it was dispatched, arrived at the Australian Home Affairs Department and at the Prime Minister's office in Canberra. The document was brief, unambiguous, and devastating in its implications for the commercial viability of the Besties Retreat. It stated in the precise language of official diplomatic communication that the upcoming visit of the Mountbatten Windsors was to be treated strictly as a private commercial venture conducted by two private citizens. It carried no request. It made no suggestion. It was a formal classification, issued by the appropriate authority, with full knowledge of the consequences that classification would produce. Those consequences were immediate and total. By formally defining the trip as private and commercial rather than royal adjacent or quasi-official, the memo removed the legal and procedural basis on which the Australian government could have justified providing any state-funded resources for the visit. No government motorcades, no diplomatic welcomes at the airport from senior officials whose presence would confer a form of institutional legitimacy on the event. No state-funded security. And it was the security element that transformed the memo from a diplomatic communication into a financial weapon of the kind that William had apparently been preparing to deploy for some time. Security arrangements for a high-profile visit of the scale, the Besties Retreat represented the kind of protection that a woman holding the title of Duchess of Sussex and attracting the level of public attention that title generates would require were estimated to cost in excess of $5 million. Under the previous arrangement, the implicit assumption had been that this cost would be absorbed through the mechanisms that fund royal adjacent security. The memo ended that assumption in a single paragraph. If Harry and Meghan wished to sell $3,200 tickets to a Sydney retreat, they would be paying the $5 million security bill out of the revenue those tickets generated. William had, in the language of one senior advisor who described the strategy with undisguised admiration, called their bluff. At approximately 8:15 inches the morning, William held a direct call with a senior representative of the New South Wales government. The reconstruction of that conversation, pieced together through accounts from individuals briefed on its content, suggests that it was conducted with the specific quality of controlled, purposeful pressure that William had been developing as a leadership style across the preceding months of institutional crisis management. He was firm, he was precise. He was not angry in any way that the official on the other end of the line could use as an opening for negotiation or reassurance. He told the official that the dignity of the crown was not for sale at a Sydney poolside event. He communicated clearly that any official recognition of the retreat by local or state authorities, any gesture that might be read as conferring quasi-governmental legitimacy on what the palace had formally classified as a private commercial venture, would be treated as a direct contradiction of the position the palace had established. The local organizers, when the substance of this communication reached them through the official channels of the New South Wales government, entered what multiple sources described as a state of absolute panic. The structural assumption on which the entire commercial proposition of the Besties Retreat had been built, the assumption that the Duchess of Sussex title carried an inherent official weight that local governments would feel obligated to support, had been explicitly and formally withdrawn. William's reported directive, delivered in the early morning hours to his assembled legal and diplomatic team, has since been characterized by those who heard it as the clearest and most unambiguous articulation of his governing philosophy on the Sussex question that he had yet produced. The monarchy is a sacred service to the public, not a billboard for hire. If any individual chooses to walk away from the heavy duties of the crown, they must also walk away from the perks, the prestige, and the profit that comes with the royal name. There would be no more half-in, half-out arrangements. No more situations in which the commercial value of the title could be extracted while the institutional obligations attached to that title were declined. The era of royal light celebrity was ending. Not gradually, not through the slow withdrawal of patience that the palace had been practicing for years, but today, in a single morning of precisely executed diplomatic and legal action. The question that anyone familiar with the history of the palace's management of the Sussex situation would ask upon hearing about the steel strike is an obvious one. Why now? What made this specific event a weekend retreat in Australia? However expensively priced and however tone-deaf its commercial positioning, the threshold that the palace decided it had finally reached? The Sussexes had been operating commercial ventures for years. The Netflix deal, the Spotify arrangement, the book, the interviews, all of it had generated revenue from the Sussex brand. And all of it had been tolerated by a palace that had consistently chosen the path of dignified silence over direct confrontation. The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of those with knowledge of the internal deliberations at Kensington Palace, has two components. The first is the petition itself. 100,000 signatures in 24 hours is not the background noise of a royal controversy. It is a democratic signal of sufficient amplitude to demand a response, not from the Sussexes, who had long since demonstrated their capacity to absorb public disapproval without altering their commercial strategies, but from the palace, whose relationship with the Commonwealth public is the institutional foundation on which its entire claim to relevance rests. The Australian public had spoken with a directness and a volume that made continued silence not merely uncomfortable but politically untenable. The palace could no longer decline to take a position without the absence of a position becoming itself a statement about the institution's willingness to allow the exploitation of its name for private profit. The second component is William's recognition of something that had been crystallizing in his thinking across the months of crisis management that had preceded March 13th. Silence in the context of the Sussex commercial operations had never functioned as neutrality. It had functioned as a form of passive endorsement, a signal to the public, to corporate partners, to governments providing security and logistical support, that the palace considered the activities in question acceptable enough to decline to challenge. Every month that the steel strike had not been executed had been a month in which the implicit message of palace silence was that the royal light business model was not sufficiently objectionable to warrant formal opposition. William had reached the conclusion that this message was both false and costly. The steel strike was the correction of a long-standing miscommunication, delivered in the only language that would be understood clearly. Formal diplomatic classification, legal directive, and the withdrawal of the financial infrastructure that had made the miscommunication economically viable. The first corporate withdrawal was confirmed within 90 minutes of the diplomatic memo reaching Canberra. A major sponsor that had attached its brand to the Besties Retreat on the basis of the perceived prestige of a Duchess's presence, the same prestige that the memo had formally reclassified as non-existent in any official, since initiated an urgent internal review that concluded in a single day with the complete removal of the brand's association from the event. By 10:30 inches the morning, two significant sponsors had initiated the same process. By 12:45 inches the afternoon, Australian media outlets were reporting that the retreat had lost more than 60% of its corporate sponsorship in under 4 hours. The commercial logic driving these withdrawals was as simple as it was devastating. The Besties Retreat had been sellable to corporate partners because of a single proposition: proximity to a Duchess. The title carried a specific form of prestige that could be translated into brand value, the association with royalty, with the institution of the monarchy. With the global attention that the Sussex story continued to attract, the $3,200 ticket price was defensible only because of that proposition. Remove the official dimension of the title, reclassify its holder as a private citizen with no institutional standing, and the proposition collapses. The premium you are charging for proximity to a duchess becomes the premium for proximity to a former actress and her husband, both of whom are currently the subjects of a 6-figure Australian petition against their commercial activities. No brand with a functioning legal department and a basic understanding of reputational risk continues paying for that proposition once it has been explicitly withdrawn by the institution that gave it its value. The Hollywood talent agencies that had been managing the Sussex's commercial interests were, by the early evening, reaching the same conclusion through a different route. The reports emerging from the agencies communicated through the informal but reliably accurate channels of entertainment industry intelligence described a rapid reassessment of the Sussex commercial viability. The grifter label, now cemented in public consciousness by a six-figure petition and the unequivocal language of the palace's diplomatic memo, had become a brand association that major corporate partners would not sustain. The Netflix deal had ended. The Spotify arrangement had collapsed. The Australian retreat was imploding in real time. Each of these individual failures had been survivable as an isolated event. In combination, assembled in the same week, they were forming a pattern that the industry was reading with the particular cold efficiency of people whose livelihoods depend on accurate assessment of commercial viability. The Sussexes were being quietly reclassified from assets to liabilities. Australia had once been the country where Harry felt most genuinely at ease in public life. The 2018 royal tour, the high energy, the enormous crowds, the specific quality of Australian warmth that had wrapped around him and Meghan at every stop had produced some of the most unambiguously joyful public images of his adult life. He had spoken about it afterward in terms that suggested it had felt like a kind of homecoming, a place where the weight of British royal protocol sat lighter and the connection between the family and the Commonwealth felt real rather than ceremonial. He had friends there. He had memories there. He had, in the years since the tour, maintained a particular affection for the country that was visible whenever it came up in interviews. By 10:30 in the morning, two significant sponsors had initiated the same process. By 12:45 in the afternoon, Australian media outlets were reporting that the retreat had lost more than 60% of its corporate sponsorship in under 4 hours. The Australia he was returning to on March 13th, 2026, was not that country. 100,000 of its citizens had signed a petition explicitly characterizing his wife's commercial venture as grifting. The government in Canberra had received a formal diplomatic memo classifying the two of them as private citizens with no claim on state resources. The retreat organizers were in free fall, the sponsors were departing. And his brother, the person who had grown up alongside him in the same institution, who shared the same parents and the same childhood and the same specific experience of being a royal child in the full glare of global media attention, had spent his morning executing a systematic dismantling of the commercial model that Harry had allowed his family's life to be built around. Insiders who were monitoring the Sussex camp's internal communications throughout the day described Harry's state as something distinct from Meghan's. Where Meghan was, in the accounts of those closest to the situation, focused on the logistics of crisis management, the urgent calls with lawyers, the frantic reassessment of the sponsorship situation, the attempt to salvage whatever commercial credibility could be salvaged from a rapidly deteriorating afternoon, Harry was described as something quieter and more final. The dream that had sustained the Sussex project from its beginning, the idea that there was a viable middle position between full royal participation and genuine private life, a space where they could enjoy the material benefits of the institution while declining its obligations, where the title could be held as a personal possession rather than a public trust, was no longer an idea that the events of March 13th allowed him to maintain. William had closed the middle ground. Not with cruelty, not with a public attack, but with a diplomatic memo and a legal directive and the cold precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a long time and had decided exactly how to execute it. The isolation that the day produced was not simply financial or reputational. It was the specific isolation of someone who made an irreversible choice in a moment of certainty and is now living in its full consequences without the option of revision. Harry had walked away from the institution. That was his right and his choice. What March 13th established, with a finality that no subsequent commercial success could undo, was that the institution had now walked away from him. At 4:30 inches the afternoon, Kensington Palace confirmed the final and most consequential element of the steel strike. under the direct advisement of the Prince of Wales. King Charles had authorized a formal clarification of status regarding the terms of the 2020 Sandringham Agreement, the arrangement under which Harry and Meghan had been permitted to step back from senior royal duties while retaining certain privileges and associations connected to their titles. The clarification was not a revocation of the titles themselves. It was something more operationally significant. A formal directive explicitly prohibiting the use of any royal title, style, or institutional association for commercial gain, the promotion of lifestyle products, or the monetization of access to the individuals holding those titles in any context that could be characterized as a private commercial venture. The practical consequence of this directive was the transformation of the Duchess of Sussex title from a commercial asset into a historical courtesy. Meghan could continue to hold it. It would appear on certain formal documents and in certain social contexts where it had been established by previous usage. But she could no longer invoke the institutional weight it carried, could no longer leverage the royal association it represented, could no longer build commercial propositions on the foundation of the prestige it conferred in any context that generated personal revenue. The title would remain, but the product it had been turned into would cease to exist. The steel strike had not simply damaged the Sussex commercial operation. It had removed the thing that made the commercial operation possible. William's words to the senior council, as reconstructed by those briefed on the 10:15 a.m. consultation, articulated the principle behind the directive with a clarity that had apparently been building in his thinking for months. This is not about family feelings. This is about the survival of the crown. We cannot allow the honors of the United Kingdom to be sold like tickets to a poolside disco. If they wish to be private citizens in California, they must relinquish the right to represent the name. The bill has come due. The crown is no longer paying it. The king, by all accounts moved by the coherence and the moral force of his son's position, gave his full blessing to the steel strike's final phase. It was the clearest demonstration of the father-son alignment that had been building throughout the succession crisis. A king who understood that the legacy he was protecting required him to authorize actions that would be personally painful, and a son who had been prepared to execute those actions for longer than the institutions around him had been prepared to permit. The narrative that had sustained the Sussex project from its earliest days, the narrative of a couple victimized by a cruel and outdated institution, forced out of the family they had served by a combination of institutional racism, personal hostility, and a media culture that had made their lives impossible, did not survive March 13th intact. It was not destroyed by any direct refutation or any palace counter-narrative. It was undermined, gradually and then entirely, by the specific commercial decisions that the events of the day had placed on public display. The $3,200 ticket, the guaranteed group photograph at the premium tier, the gala dinner where the Duchess of Sussex was the keynote speaker, the title that had allegedly caused immense and documented pain, now serving as the commercial hook for an Australian weekend retreat. The public was not being asked to perform a sophisticated logical analysis of the contradiction between the stated injury and the commercial exploitation. The contradiction was presenting itself in the form of a four-figure ticket price, with a clarity that required no analysis at all. 100,000 Australians had processed it in 24 hours and reached the same conclusion. The verdict, expressed in the language of a petition titled "No Royal Grifting on Australian Soil," was blunt, but it was not unfair. It was the natural conclusion of a public that had been told the title was a burden and had then been asked to pay for the privilege of standing next to it. Royal commentators had been pointing to examples of genuinely successful royal entrepreneurship as a contrast to the Sussex commercial model. Princess Madeleine of Sweden, Marie Chantal of Greece. Women who had navigated the specific challenge of building independent professional lives while holding royal titles, who had created businesses with real products and real commercial merit that did not depend on the title for their value, who had respected the boundary between their institutional role and their private enterprise with a consistency that had preserved both. The comparison was instructive not because it was flattering to those individuals, but because it illustrated the specific failure of the Sussex approach. The Besties Retreat was not a business that happened to be run by a duchess. It was a business whose entire commercial proposition was the Duchess. Remove the title and the retreat has no premium price point, no corporate sponsors, no gala speaker, no petition against it. The title was not adjacent to the business model. It was the business model. And that was precisely the thing that the steel strike had made impossible to sustain. The contrast that March 13th produced was not accidental. William understood, and had understood for some time, that the most effective way to communicate the distinction between what the monarchy represents and what the Sussex commercial operation represented was not through statements, but through images, through the visible, documented, photographable difference between how a future king spends his time and how a couple charging thousands of dollars for manifestation sessions spends theirs. While Meghan was in a Sydney hotel suite, dealing with the cascading consequences of the sponsor withdrawals, the urgent calls with lawyers, the frantic recalibration of a commercial proposition that had lost its institutional foundation, the specific fury of someone watching a carefully constructed plan dissolve in real time, William was at a Commonwealth briefing focused on the global cost of living crisis and the sustainable housing initiatives he had been championing for years. The work was unglamorous. It generated no ticket revenue. It did not charge attendees for proximity to the Prince of Wales. It was, in the plainest possible terms, service the thing the monarchy exists to perform, the thing that justifies the institution's claim on public resources and public goodwill, the thing that the Besties Retreat, with its gala seating charts and its group photograph packages, had replaced with a commercial transaction. William's final statement of the day, delivered through his office as the London evening was beginning, has been described by those who read it as the clearest summation of what the steel strike was intended to accomplish and what it had. "We spent years trying to bridge the gap," he reportedly said, "but today the public drew the line for us. You cannot claim to manifest a better world while selling the dignity of a 1,000-year-old institution for a group photo. The boundary between service and celebrity is now a wall. They chose their path, and today we ensured they cannot walk both sides ever again. The grift is over. The words were not designed to wound. They were designed to close. To establish, in the most unambiguous language available to a future king who was not yet in a position to speak with the formal authority of a monarch, that a decision had been made and would not be revisited, the talent agencies in Hollywood, processing the day's events as the California afternoon unfolded, were reaching their own conclusions through the arithmetic of commercial viability. The Netflix deal had ended. The Spotify arrangement had gone. The Australian retreat was imploding. Each failure had been individually a data point. In combination, assembled in the same week, they were something else. A pattern that described not a commercial operation navigating a difficult period, but a commercial operation that had lost the one thing that had made it viable. Without the institutional credibility that the steel strike had formally withdrawn, the Sussex brand had no premium proposition. It was two individuals, one a former actress, one a former prince with a lifestyle platform, a California mansion, and a global reputation for controversy. That was a product that could be sold in certain markets to certain audiences. But it was not a product that commanded $3,200 ticket prices or $5 million security infrastructure paid for by anyone other than themselves. The sun set over London at approximately 6:15 on the evening of March 13th, 2026. William was at his desk. He had been at his desk in various configurations and with various teams assembled around him in person and on encrypted lines for more than 13 hours. The steel strike was complete. The diplomatic memo had been dispatched and received. The legal directive had been authorized and confirmed. The sponsors had departed. The security arrangement had been reclassified. The title had been legally stripped of its commercial utility while leaving its formal existence intact. The work of the day was done. What the Besties Retreat had been intended to accomplish was a triumphant return, the restoration of the Sussex brand's global credibility in a country that had once loved them, the demonstration that the commercial model they had built in California could generate revenue and attention on the international stage, the proof that the royal life they had designed for themselves was viable and sustainable and not dependent on the tolerance of an institution they had publicly criticized for years. What it had actually accomplished was the precise opposite of all of those things. It had given William the public mandate he needed to act 100,000 signatures, providing a democratic authorization that no palace communication could have generated independently. It had revealed, with a clarity that no amount of careful brand management could obscure, the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Sussex commercial proposition. And it had produced, in the steel strike, the permanent legal architecture that closed the space the Sussex project had been operating in. The monarchy that William is in the process of building does not contain a middle position. You carry the title and you carry the duty, or you carry neither. The half-in, half-out arrangement, the idea that institutional prestige could be harvested for private profit while institutional obligations were declined, was always, in William's view, a temporary accommodation rather than a sustainable model. March 13th was the day that accommodation was formally ended. Not in anger, not in retaliation, but in the cold, deliberate language of diplomatic classification and legal directive, executed by a man who had been thinking about this day for a long time and who had chosen his moment with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment would eventually present itself. The petition gave him the moment. The Besties Retreat gave him the justification. The steel strike gave the monarchy what it had needed for years and had been too cautious, too hopeful, or too focused on preserving family harmony to take: a clear, permanent, legally established boundary between the institution and those who had chosen to stand outside it while continuing to profit from standing at its edge. The theater is closed, the door is shut. And the future king, in his study as the Windsor grounds darkened around him, turned to the next item on his desk. There would be more work tomorrow, there always was. But the work of today at least was done.